Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ACTA conference. We're going to start, even though I know that there are some people not here yet, probably still on the freeway going in the round and round in circles like I did about an hour and a half ago. I'm your MC today. My name is Eve Hillary, and I want to tell you what ACTA means. It's the Australian Chemical Trauma Alliance, which to some of you means a support group, and others it means a group that disseminates information or even engages in some little bit of activism from time to time. But it is basically an organisation of men and women who share information, strength and hope after having experienced illness or injury following chemical exposure. And some of us are familiar with chemical exposure, some of us are familiar with the sequel of chemical exposure. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. There are 11, and we have Australia's guiding lights. Some of them are involved in unique and original research. Some of them have been generating papers, and all of them have been extremely helpful to those who have been chemically injured. I would like to ask you to turn off your mobile phones, and we're just going to start today, and I understand that people can just come in as they will later on. But the first speaker this morning will be Dr. Archie Kalokerinos, who probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you an introduction anyway. He's a war horse. He's been around for a very long time. He's a trailblazer. He's best known for his work among Australian Indigenous communities, and he's been widely recognised as having significantly lowered the infant mortality among Aboriginal infants under his care. He's pioneered the use of vitamin C in Australia and developed a new and effective approach to the practice of medicine. His work was acknowledged by Nobel Prize winner Professor Linus Pauling. He's known as a doctor who really cares about his patients. In recognition for his work, he's been awarded the Greek Australian of the Century Award. In recent years, he's carried on work in his areas of interest, which include sudden infant death and shaken baby syndrome. He is advisor to various Indigenous groups, both in Australia and overseas. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Archie Kalokerinos.
Thank you, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. First, I must thank those that have helped to organise this conference, and particularly I want to thank Blackmores and others for their special support, and also for the vast amount of information that they are able to spread throughout this country of ours that is so useful to so many people. Now, I thought for a long time just what I should speak about today, and I decided that I should speak about a report that appeared in the news media a few weeks ago that seemed to suggest very strongly that if people took vitamin C they would get cancer. Now, I would like to express my views, as Mum Shirley Smith, the Aboriginal activist lady who died a few years ago, expressed, but I'm afraid the language is very rude and I won't embarrass you. The fact is that this experiment that was quoted from a journal called Science appeared to show that, according to some journalists, that vitamin C, if taken as a supplement, could cause DNA damage and therefore cancer. Now, it was purely a test tube experiment, and anyone who bothered to read the actual article itself will see that it has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on what happens in the body. Now, I went to the trouble before I left home to photocopy just a few copies of some of the scientific information that is available about this, And I've only got 3 of them here with me that I'll be prepared to let anyone look at, and if anyone especially wants further information on it, if they contact me in Tamworth, I'll photocopy some more of it and send to them. The fact is that the biochemistry of vitamin C is very complicated indeed, at least in many of its aspects. The basic biochemistry, fortunately, is fairly simple, and that is that vitamin C is really the universal detoxifier. It's only a small molecule, like water, and in the same way that nature uses water for almost every reaction that occurs in the body, she uses vitamin C in the same sort of way. It's a sort of a stormtrooper. It gets in there first, acts quickly, and then pulls out and depends on follow-up with various other substances to continue the battle. And of course its most obvious example in respect to a conference like this is that it detoxifies almost every goddamn chemical that can hurt you. And it does this very effectively, provided that adequate amounts are there. In other words, anyone who is living in this polluted world of ours, who doesn't take these antioxidant supplements, which includes vitamin C, vitamin E, and zinc and selenium and a whole host of other things, is, in my opinion, committing early suicide. The risks vary, of course. Some people have such good genes that they can do everything wrong, they can even smoke and so forth, and they live to be 90 or 100. But the average person won't live very long. Last October, we had our 50th graduation reunion at the University of Sydney. There are 120 of us left, out of about 260. And many of us had our wives with us. And someone asked if anyone who was there who wasn't on any routine medication to put their hands up. And only 5 hands went up. One was mine, one was Catherine, my wife's, and there were 3 others. I have never lost a day's work from illness in my life. Sure, I've had plenty of accidents, put me in hospital. And I wouldn't know how many fights I've got into that also put me in hospital. And I attribute that to a large extent to the simple fact that, generally speaking, I eat right, I live right, and I take supplements. Now, the problem we have, of course, is that for some reason that I still don't really fully understand, many so-called medical authorities in the world are violently against the taking of supplements. You'll hear this old story, why take them? You simply excrete it in your urine, and they talk about expensive urine that you flush down the toilet. Well, you know, you do exactly the same thing with the water that you drink. You drink it, and shortly afterwards you go to the toilet and you flush it down the toilet. You could say, well, what a waste of water. You know, why bother to drink it? We all know that the water does its job on the way through. And that's exactly what vitamin C and these other substances do on their way through. If you want to be a purist, you should really examine the biochemical systems in your body, particularly the antioxidant systems and so forth, and see how they are functioning. Now, this is a very expensive and a very difficult procedure, but it can be done. And only if you can be sure that all those biochemical systems are working properly because they have adequate supplies of various things like the antioxidants, can you say that you don't need to take supplements. Now, needless to say, that is never really done because it's time-consuming, it's expensive, and it's complicated, and a lot of it still isn't understood. But just the same, that is the ideal that we should all aim at. Now, it's incredible to think that with such a simple thing that there should be so much opposition. But unfortunately, that is true. Quite a few years ago, nearly 20 years ago, it might have been more I think, I was in Mexico and I gave a lecture at the Institute of Nutrition. And after the lecture, a research paediatrician stood up and asked a question. He said that he was working in an area amongst Aztec Indians with a research team of paediatricians, and during that year 600 babies had been born. And during the year at different times, 60 of these babies had been taken to the clinic by the Indian mothers who said, "My baby is sick." And they were examined by the paediatricians and nothing could be found wrong with them, so they were sent home. And they all died suddenly and unexpectedly a few hours later. And autopsies didn't explain why. In other words, they were sudden infant deaths. And he asked me if I thought that would vitamin C supplements stop these deaths? And I said, well, yes, but you'll soon find out. Well, I went back to Mexico City a year later to give a lecture at an international conference there on nutrition. And the wife of the organiser of the conference chaired my lecture. And the organiser himself came and stood up at the back when I started to talk. And after the lecture, his wife stated publicly to this vast audience that they'd listened to what I had to say the year before, and they're supplementing a group of expectant mothers and newborn babies, and they're going to see at the end of a period of a few years if there's any difference in the death rate. Well, I was ecstatic. I waited for a year, I waited for 2 years, heard nothing. I wrote letters that were never answered. I sent telegrams that were never answered. I tried to make phone calls, no one would put me through. And I smelt a rat, a very dirty, a very big and a very stinking rat. A few years ago, when I got onto the internet for the first time at the insistence of my son and a few colleagues, I thought, well, I'll look up myself. And this is what I found. This was in March 1998. I found an article by a Professor D. Cristofaro, who is Assistant Professor of Paediatrics, Medical Director of the Infant Care Program in America. And he said there's a theory that vitamin C deficient acute infantile scurvy is a prime cause of SIDS. And this is proposed by Kalokerinos and so forth and so on. And he said, last year I was contacted by a physician in Mexico who told me that SIDS had disappeared in the village after he began to administer vitamin C to all pregnant women in his village and to the newborns after birth. Now I'll repeat that, SIDS had disappeared. Now that is a dramatic statement to make. You would think that Professor D. Cristofaro would light up and say, boy, we better look into this, because this was dramatic. But no, this was his answer. To date, I know of no data to support these claims. And then he goes on for a couple of pages, actually, to say what a terrible bloke Archie Kalokerinos is. Now, what in the hell has that got to do with it? What sort of bloke I am? You see? Now, obviously, I connect that with the problems I had, and it seems to me, strange though this may seem, there's only one possible solution. They don't really want these infants to live. And I know this is a terrible thing to say, and I hate saying it because it turns people off me. They say no one could possibly act like that. But if you can think of another explanation, let me know. And I've written about that in my book, which was published earlier this year. And that is just a fair sample of how much the authorities really even seem to, for some reason or other, seem to hate the whole idea of taking supplements. Now, looking at this article a little bit further, as I said, I think earlier, the biochemistry of vitamin C is extremely complex. So complex that there are really only a few people on this earth of ours who can say that they even begin to understand the complexities of it. But despite that, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that it can do any harm. And the very person who was the main author of the article stated, and I'll try to quote this exactly, the lead researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Ian Blair, is quoted in the press as having said, "Absolutely, for God's sake, don't say vitamin C causes cancer." But of course the media are saying exactly that. Now how that can be allowed, how that can be excused, is absolutely beyond me. But I've been in this business for a long time, and I've never had so many requests for information as I've had for information about this. So obviously it disturbed a lot of people. Even friends of mine feel that they should stop taking their vitamin C because they're going to drop dead from cancer. And that obviously is an extreme worry. So I've got three photocopies of this that I'll make available for anyone who wants to read, and you can take them with you too, for that matter, if you want to. Now, coming back to the subject of chemicals in our environment, if we all live in a perfect environment, if our food was grown under absolutely perfect conditions, if our genes were good, then we wouldn't need to take supplements. And I should perhaps add that provided we are physically fit. But because this earth is polluted to hell, because our food is grown in a fashion that is most disturbing, and because we're really not, very few of us are really physically fit, and because our genes have already been affected by this situation, then supplements are an absolute must. As I think previous meetings of ours have illustrated quite clearly, you can even reverse the DNA damage that these chemicals do by living right, eating right, and taking supplements. And the problem is this, that if you continue to live in this polluted world and eat the polluted food, that the chances are, but it's a real chance, much better than winning the lottery, that if you don't do something about it, that your genes will be affected and you'll pass this defect on to your children and then on to your grandchildren, and it gets worse each generation. And if you want to see what happens, you want to go to Russia, because they've been careless there for a much longer period of time than anywhere else. And the picture is very, very depressing indeed. And if you want to see how you can reverse some of the damage, then look at the sperm counts of men. Not just the sperm counts, but the motility of the sperms, the activity of the sperms, and the number of abnormal sperms. And although there's some controversy, it's generally accepted that sperm counts are falling, abnormal forms are increasing, and motility is decreasing. There's a report by the New York Academy of Sciences, which is a very prestigious academy, some years ago and published, that illustrated quite clearly that all you had to do is take 500 lousy milligrams of vitamin C a day and the sperm counts went up and the motility improved and the number of abnormals dropped. If we were cattle, if we were bulls, us men I mean, some of us might think we are, they wouldn't breed from us. They slaughter us and feed us to the Japs. And yet no one seems to be very concerned about this. They do all sorts of tests on a pregnant woman. You know, you ever seen the list of tests that they do? And if we didn't do them, we'd be charged with negligence. And yet us men, of course, we're very superior creatures, obviously. The first thing people do when they have a prospective son-in-law is to check on him. You know, if he owns a Ferrari and he's got a house in the eastern suburbs and he owns an aeroplane and he owns shares in Blackmores, and, you know, he's a fine man. First thing I would do, and I'll leave the rest to the imagination. Now these are very simple but very serious things. And for those that haven't heard me speak before, I'll just finish by telling you about two very important issues. When I was a boy in Glen Innes, and I was there until I was 12, 13 years old, I cannot remember a single child at school that had asthma. In those days, before we had the treatments that we've got now, if there was anyone with asthma, I would pretty soon know it. There certainly wasn't a child in my class, or above it or below it, or in my brother's classes, above or below them. Now at least 2 out of 5 kids in Glen Innes are puffing away at Ventolin. Also, when I was a boy, otitis media was extremely rare here in Australia. Sore ears, in other words. That if you did get a bad attack, you're in trouble because you didn't have antibiotics, but it was rare. There were 5 children in our family. No one ever had an attack of otitis media. Now, otitis media is so common that some women literally live in a doctor's surgery with one kid after the other with recurrent attacks of otitis media. And 25% of the antibiotics that are used in the United States are used to treat kids that have otitis media. And I'm including elderly people with operations and pneumonia, you name it. 25% of the antibiotics. Doctors are so used to seeing these kids with otitis media, they think it is normal. It isn't. It's a direct indication of how our genes have been affected, our immune system has been affected. And it's just the tip of an iceberg and it's going to get worse. So this whole study of chemicals in the environment and our reaction to the environment, so forth, pollution in the environment, is one of extreme importance because, unfortunately, it affects our mental responses as well. It affects our IQ. And it particularly affects that part of our intelligence that's involved with motivation. So if you're physically fit and fine and your body biochemistry is working well, you wake up in the morning and you'll want to get things done and do things properly. But if your body biochemistry is bad news, you wake up in the morning and you'll say, bugger it. I'll go and have a few beers with my mates, I'll smoke a packet of cigarettes, I'll go and shoot myself up with drugs, who cares? And although it sounds an oversimplification, in fact it isn't. In other words, the work that we are involved in is one of extreme importance. And although we can't control the world, at least we can do one thing, we can look after ourselves. We live right, we eat right, and we take our supplements. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen.